So first of all, if you would please say your name for the camera and tell me a little bit about, who you are right now. Who are you?
I am Kim Mosby. I am a graduate student at the University of New Orleans. I am working on my doctorate degree. I have my I have an AA, an associate's from my community college. I have a bachelor's from Gallatin at New York University. I have a sociology degree, a master's in sociology from UNO. In a couple of months, I will have my master's in urban and regional planning from UNO, and in about a year, I'll have my doctorate in urban studies.
Woohoo, that's a lot. That's a lot.
I borrowed too much money for UNO. And not UNO, for NYU.
Oops.
And UNO is saving me,
Okay.
giving me a degree that I can actually use rather than one that just put me in debt.
So we can pick up on that thread maybe later because my daughter's about to go to college. But anyhow.
Community college is the way to go. It really is. One of the best things I did was starting 2 years at a community college, because when I went to NYU, they couldn't nitpick at my credits. I went in with an associate's degree, so they couldn't say, well, your writing isn't up to par, you don't have foreign language credits, you have to do this, you have to take all of those freshman courses that they make transfer students take. They couldn't make me take that, because they couldn't say, oh, this came from an institution that isn't up to our standards.
Right.
They said, you have a degree. What do you want to do next? It's the best way to go.
Nice. And what community college did you go to?
It's called DMAC, Des Moines Area Community College. I'm originally from Iowa.
Okay. I was hoping you were in New York State because my daughter's in New York. Moving on. So, what are you doing here at UNO if you were Des Moines, Iowa, and then NYU?
I moved into my dorm room at NYU August 29th, 2005. I'm from an all-white community. There are a few people of color in the community, don't get me wrong, I'm obviously from there, but I spent my entire life being like, oh, who let the black girl in? So I was always searching for a black community. I'm biracial, but I was raised by the white side of my family, so going to New York was that image in my mind from TV that I would find diversity, that I would find people of color, that I would find a community that I fit into. And so I always wanted to go there. I love to sing. I was like, I can have a music career. I can do everything. New York is that land of opportunity. But when I moved into New York, I put myself in a white and Asian school because I didn't do my research. The demographics of the people who go to NYU were nowhere like me. I followed a friend from Iowa, a friend from high school. She was a year older than me. She got into NYU. I had really impeccable grades. I could get into NYU. Her parents are doctors. My mom is a single parent nurse. So very large income discrepancies, but I didn't want money to stop me from having a future. So I chose to go to NYU, and I spent my first week in New York not only feeling like I was 13 all over again, because everything was new and everything was so different, not what I had pictured it would be, and I saw the black faces I was looking for dying on TV. So my birthday is over spring break. I had enough money saved up to go home to see my friends for my spring break. And instead I used that money to buy a bus ticket and come down to volunteer. There was
to volunteer in
New Orleans. There was a spring break initiative called Katrina on the Ground that was specifically targeted to black college students, realizing that the effort those most impacted by Hurricane Katrina, all of the research shows it was poor African Americans from New Orleans. Of the entire Gulf Coast region, the place that got it the worst. Not necessarily because of the impact of the storm, but because of the aftermath of the storm, because of the flooding that happened when the levees failed, or when the levees were dynamited, depending on who you ask, was the reason that poor black folks in New Orleans are the most impacted from Hurricane Katrina and still continue to be the most impacted from Hurricane Katrina. So in response to a black community needing help, the first wave of the relief effort was majority white. And so this Spring Break initiative grew out of black organizers realizing that there needed to be a way for black college students to come down and be involved so that black college students could help their community and so that their community could see that their kids cared about them too.
So can I take us back a few minutes?
Yeah.
The research shows. Can you describe a little bit of that for people who are not from New Orleans, don't know anything about New Orleans? Because there's a lot of hearsay out there. Can you talk a little bit from your perspective as a researcher about the data associated with the aftermath of Katrina?
There's scores of it. I am in the process of becoming a doctor in academia, so I know how important it is to know authors' names, but I don't have all of them memorized yet. So please bear with me. I know some of the most important reports that I've used in my thesis. Susan Cutter does a lot of research on social vulnerability that started long before Hurricane Katrina, going around and looking at disasters and seeing which counties had the highest percentages when storms would happen, who had the most damage, who had the return rates that weren't the same, just where these different disparities and where the different impacts of disaster happened. And she created, with other scholars, she created a social vulnerability index. And the social vulnerability index is a way to categorize and see, you know, which factors are leading for these areas to be the most impacted, leading to the vulnerability of these different parts of counties. And so she came that there's a list of factors, but the most important factors are race, class, gender, age, and ability. And so you saw in Hurricane Katrina how that played out, where 67% of the population were African Americans, 72% of the people who were displaced and impacted by the storm were African Americans. So some people were like, oh, it's only a 5% difference. But if you're a smaller part of the population, you shouldn't be a larger portion of those affected by something. You know, or if you are, that leads to the realization in academia that there's something going on. Why is this happening? And so trying to dig into how come we see these different results for these different groups. And there was a CRC, I'm probably going to call it wrong, but a congressional report for Congress, I believe. I believe the first author was Gabe. There was like 5 or 6 different authors on this piece, and it has all of the statistics about who the storm impacted. And so I pulled a lot from, when writing my thesis and as I work on my dissertation, pulling a lot from that data just on which counties were affected, the statistics on poverty, that, you know, the state of Louisiana has high poverty percentage. I believe it's around 18 or 19% at the time of the storm, but those who are affected, it was closer to, I might say it wrong, 22, 23, like it was higher. Again, not some like 20 or 30% higher, but still you see these percentages going, well, why are the people with the fewest resources those hit the hardest by the storm? And what does that mean for recovery when those with the fewest resources are those those most impacted by the storm?
So you came down here to help in response to a call for help to college-age African Americans. What were your first thoughts when you got here, and more importantly, why did you decide to move here afterwards, after seeing that devastation?
Moving was a long time in coming. That was still, you know, a year and a half out.
I mean, you see things devastated.
I didn't see things devastated. I saw the water gone. I came down 7 months after the storm and not a goddamn thing had changed. I had the realization when I lived in Iowa, I had a car. I could have gotten myself out of harm's way. I couldn't take that car to New York with me. It didn't make sense to have a car in New York City. So I was one of the carless people. I'm not from a family that has a lot of money. When I came down, I saw it would have been me. I would have been that person stuck on rooftops. I would have had money to get out of town. I had my $150 to get a bus ticket to go home. I would have had money to get out. But they shut down Greyhound and told Greyhound they couldn't come into the city 2 days before the mandatory evacuation. They told Amtrak they couldn't come into the city. They shut down the flights before the mandatory evacuation. I would have been trapped. When I came down, I realized that. I realized if this hit New York, that would have been my ass on those buildings. There was no degree of separation, like this isn't me, this couldn't happen to me. It was very, very real. Those people were me, and they would have been me if this had happened somewhere else. And that's what I saw when I came down. And by being a spring break initiative that was specifically to pull Black college students down into this environment, it wasn't they put on the show, oh yes, you're coming to help. And yes, we did work with organizations, and there were people who gutted houses, and there were people who did all different sorts of things to help and contribute. But it was a political education for us Black college students coming down so that we would realize where we fit in the context of this country. And it was more about political education than it was about trying to do something in a week. It was that realization, no matter what you can give in a week, New Orleans is going to need a lot more than that. And what New Orleans needs and what this country needs to prevent this situation from happening again is educated youth. Not people coming in and saying, oh, here's a hand, here's fixing something, but youth coming in and identifying that this is your country and this is your status in this country, and if you don't do anything about it, it's going to be you next time.
What can be done about it? We had an interview the other day, and we're following up again tomorrow with some very angry young men. I would like to know what you think people can do about it.
The only thing that I believe is going to change this country is organizing. We have to come together. You have to go out, you have to knock on doors. We have to get past this idea that meetings are going to change things, and we have to change the way that meetings happen. Because it is important to get ideas from people, it is important to come together and talk, and it is important to hear where people are at. But in my studies, I've come across Iris Marion Young and her ideas on power, and looking at the power structure and just really realizing that we live in a racist society. It's not racist in terms of individual actions against people. I mean, you see those incidents of racism and people can easily identify those and easily say, oh, I don't do that. But people don't look at the systemic issues of racism, the way that it's institutionalized into everything that we do, the ways that everyone in this country is racist regardless of the color of their skin. Everybody thinks poorly about dark-skinned people. The darker you are, the worse connotation our society has about you, and that's bred into everybody. And because of that, when you have meetings, you might say, oh, everyone is coming to this meeting, everyone has the opportunity, everyone has the chance to talk. But when you sit in the meeting and you see who speaks up and who doesn't speak up, you start to see the different power dynamics in our society. And not just in who feels comfortable to speak up and who doesn't feel comfortable to speak up, but when people do speak up, who's listened to, whose opinions are valid. And you can see how, who gets cut off. Who does the facilitator come in and say, oh, you're not worth listening to? Whose hands do they call on? All of those situations are a direct result of our power relations in our society, but we don't think about those things when we hold our meetings. Working on a planning degree has really showed me, brought me into the research on public participation. How do you have meaningful public participation? And I think one of the first things that we need to do is realize that our meeting structure doesn't account for power differences. That our society structure of going out and thinking who's valid and who's not valid, we don't dig down into why we think those things, where those ideas came from. We don't unpack that. But, talking about race, especially in light of what's going on with Ferguson and all of the police shootings that have been happening, that not have been happening recently, that have been happening since, lynchings are still happening. There is no time when this started. Like, you have to go back to slavery. It's not something that stopped. This is something that the media is focusing on right now. This is something that's a hotbed issue right now. But anyone in the Black community can tell you this isn't new. You can go back and look at what happened in Atlanta in the 90s. The scores of Black children that just came up missing. I'm probably off on some weird tangent.
That's
but
quite all right. I think you're bringing together a bunch of threads that are important to weave. So
when you think about what's going to change stuff, we have to start talking about those things. We have to create the space for the angry voices to come in and be heard. We have to find ways for them to be leading the meetings. We have to go out to the people who are most impacted by the war on drugs, by the war on poverty, by all of these different programmatic things that the top has decided. You have to go down to the bottom. You have to say, well, what is really destroying your community? Do you have an issue with the fact that there are, do you have an issue with the fact that people are smoking marijuana on their front porches? Or do you have a fact that there are no men in your community that can get jobs because they've been smoking marijuana on their porches? Or because they were walking down the street and they got accosted by the police? There are so many things where it's so easy in our society. We say you have an arrest record and that means you did something wrong. And that means I can judge you because you got caught doing something in a court of your peers. how can it be a court of my peers when everyone on the jury is white, but one person isn't? You know, like that's not justice. But you know, we won't go into those issues. But by systemically saying, okay, now you have this felony. In Louisiana, the first time you get caught with a joint, it's a misdemeanor. The second time, it's a felony. The quantity doesn't have to increase. Just the fact you got caught twice, it's a felony. And that means you can never get a job again. Or if you get a job, you know, you have to declare that you have a felony. You're not eligible for financial aid if you want to go to school. You're not eligible for any type of social service programs. You know, it closes so many doors. But people say that's justified because you got caught committing a crime. One of the things that I've done down here is be a youth intern for they have a public defender's branch or not a public defender's branch. They have a juvenile branch of the public defender's office. It's its own nonprofit entity, but it's basically the public defender's office, and it handles all the juvenile cases. I interned for them, and one of the kids that I wrote his post-dispositional plan for was convicted because he was sitting on his aunt's porch. The cops came up, decided to accost him because he's a young black male. They searched him, didn't find anything on him, so then they decided to search the neighborhood. You know, when you live in a poor black community, which they call high crime, high drug traffic area, you should not be surprised if you find something on the ground. It's like walking through and you find a cigarette butt on the ground, you might find a joint or a blunt, you know, a wrapper on the ground. The cops, you know, searched the block. They found drug paraphernalia. They said, this is yours. You know, and now he's in a position where, you know, you can go to trial, but it's your word against the cops. No one's going to listen to a young black male versus cops, not in this city, not in most cities, not in this country.
But the population of blacks in New Orleans is pretty high. Why wouldn't they listen? I mean, I'm trying to figure out here when you have so many people.
Because everybody is racist. It's not something that just affects white people. It's something that affects black folks. We've been taught that we deserve what we get. We've been taught, I mean, you even have black celebrities coming through and saying that these are the issues with the black community and it's our fault. No one really wants to go back and say, well, these are systemic issues that come from the way society was structured on slave labor. Nobody wants to go back and say, you know, it's been declared multiple times that black folks in this country deserve reparations for what they went through. But nobody wants to listen to that. No one wants to address what poverty does to folks, what it means when you can't eat, what it means when you can't take care of your children, what it means when you don't think you're going to live past 16, when you don't think you're going to live past 18. And it's not just, I don't think I'm going to live past this age, but everyone who I know isn't living past this age. One of the clients that I worked for held his best friend in his arms as he died. They were both 16 years old. You know, and people will point fingers and say, oh, that's because some other black kid shot him and that's why we have to deal with black on black crime and all of this other bullshit. But no one wants to say, well, where did the guns come from? Where did the bullets come from? Why are they in schools that don't teach them how to read? You know, like there are so many things that can be fixed and changed, but you can't just look at a problem and say you are the reason for that problem. Yes, everybody makes choices, but not everybody makes choices from the same box of opportunity. And I think that's one of the real issues in our society. It doesn't matter what color you are. We're all taught that if you work hard, we live in a meritocracy, and if you work, you can accomplish anything. But statistics prove otherwise. You know, if you don't go to a good school, if you don't learn how to read because an educational system doesn't provide that to you, how are you going to fill out a job application?
What do you think of the education system? We've heard quite a bit about that since we've been here. I mean, I personally left in 2001, and one of the reasons I left is my daughter was going to be facing either public schools here, or I was going to have to pay for private ones. So I was upset about that. That wasn't the only reason we left, but it was a big part of it. Mm-hmm. And we've heard from folks here everything from oh, they're revamping the schools and we'll have to see, to, oh, it's really great, there are all these choices now that that weren't here before Katrina. Where do you think things are with the education system from your perspective? And I'm thinking mostly primary, secondary ed when I'm saying this, not so much the higher ed.
Yeah, like elementary and high school and that stuff.
Yeah.
The conversion to charter schools. It's so scary. As being a community organizer, the sentiment that I heard a lot was, why are they experimenting on us? I was invited to go out to California where they've had a charter school initiative out there and just learning about how they to me, it feels like a lot of smoke and mirrors. We have this good facade saying we've got all this choice, we've got all this opportunity. But when you start looking at different things, there are tiers of who gets into where. So if your parents have a proper job, you can get into some of the best schools, meaning that they work for one of the universities that is the board of directors for some of these different charter schools. So like by going to UNO or by working at UNO, you become in tier 1 so that your children will have an opportunity to go to the UNO charter schools. One of which I believe is Benjamin Franklin, which is one of the best schools in New Orleans. Depending on where you go, right now one of my friends is paying, I think, $4,000 a year for preschool, because if her child goes through this Montessori preschool program, next year she can get into the top schools. Like she can be tier 1 in those schools because of her preschool education. But so you're implementing this new system, but what about all of these kids that weren't part of this system, that didn't have those opportunities, that don't have the financial means? They're automatically shuttled and pushed into the RSD public schools. Public education was an issue in New Orleans before the storm. You mentioned your decisions were 2001. Public education is an issue, I believe, in all cities that have Black populations. And not just Black populations, but any city that is an older city and has a suburban ring around it, the money moved out. And when the money moved out, there was a period in time up through the early 1900s where as cities expanded and the wealth moved out to get away from the congestion and the dirtiness of the city, they would annex the areas. So that's how New York City grew from just a little part of Manhattan to the 5 boroughs. Because as the wealth dispersed, they said, you can't leave, you can't take our tax base, you can't come into the city and work and then leave and expect not to pay taxes and not to pay dues to this city. We're stopping that. And so they would vote, but of course more people lived inside of the city than lived in the suburbs. So when the people of the city voted, they're like, yes, you're going to continue to pay taxes to us. And that's how, over time, New York expanded. It wasn't just New York that happened that way. Most cities expanded. That's how Orleans Parish, it started out just the French Quarter. And as it grew, the wealth always moves out. As the city grew, now the city takes up the entire parish. But now the suburbs lie further out. And so you see that we have this pattern in society, or in our history, where the wealth moves out. The critical point in time, I can't remember the year, but the suburbs, the rich folks said, oh no, we're not down with this. We don't want to be paying taxes to the city, even if we have to go into the city. We want to have our own government. We want to control what goes on in our area. We don't want to be tied to everything else. We want our independence. And so you can see in the history, there was a Supreme Court decision, court ruling saying that cities could no longer decide for the jurisdictions, that it had to be up to the jurisdiction if they wanted to be annexed or not, and that it wasn't up to the city anymore. And so you see these patterns of allowing the wealth to move out. So then when they started going back in the 50s and 60s and challenging integration and challenging segregation, not challenging integration, when they started fighting for equality, you had these systems set up where all of our tax money is going to go to our schools. So all of the city tax money goes to their schools. But now we're going to say you have to be integrated inside of the school district. So you have the white flight of the 60s. So the wealth that's the next wave of wealth leaving the cities, leaving the inner cities disinvested. You know, it's also the time of redlining. You know, after the world wars, you can't get any money to come back. I'm saying it poorly. After World War II, you had this great economic boom because people were constrained during wartime. There wasn't new housing being built. There wasn't all of these things because all of our efforts were towards the war effort. So then there's this great time, like, okay, all of these troops are coming back, everybody's coming home, there's all these pent up frustrations, people want to expand, they want to get married, they want to have their own houses so they can have their families. We need to deal with this. How are we going to handle it? And so you started having the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, creating procedures to loan people money, to back investments. But those guidelines came with restrictions, and those restrictions said you cannot loan this federal money. We will not guarantee any loans made to neighborhoods that we think are questionable. And they had guidelines about what made neighborhoods questionable. Neighborhoods were questionable if they had minorities in them. Neighborhoods were questionable if they were mixed, and not just 100% minorities, but if there were whites and blacks together or whites and other minorities together. That's a questionable neighborhood. We're not going to invest in that. So the only places where money was available, where people could get the financing to buy houses, would be in the suburbs. That's the only places where they would make those loans. You couldn't get a loan to fix up property inside of the city. And so, you know, people, if they wanted to have a better option and wanted to have a better house, even if they liked their neighborhood, they couldn't fix up that house because that's not what they couldn't get money to do that. So they had to follow the money, and the money was directing them out to the suburbs. So they start building their communities. You know, a lot of those suburbs had restricted covenants saying that, you know, we can't let black folks move in because if we let black folks move in, then we can't get the money because this then becomes a questionable neighborhood under these federal guidelines. That's a very good example in our history of systemic racism. That was the federal government coming down and saying you can't give money to these things because of race. You know, because of ethnicity, we're not going to let money go these different ways because we don't think this is a sound investment. And, you know, that's played out for generations. But people, you know, they like to forget about that part of history. Like, oh, no, that's not what happened. That was the decision of the banks. No, the banks were being directed by the government. That was a federal mandate. You can go back and, you know, look at the federal law and see those things. And so it filters into education, because it's a long-standing problem of the wealth leaving the city. Public education is paid for by our tax dollars. And as the city gets poorer and poorer, you don't have the foundation to be able to pay for education because all of your wealth is left. And the wealth isn't worried about it because they control their own school districts. They can make sure that their schools in their districts are good, or they have the money to pay for the private education. You know, my response to having kids in the city is I'm homeschooling. I don't have the option to pay those ridiculous bills, and I'm not going to send my child to a place that's not going to teach them to read, not going to teach them to do math, and is only going to call the cops on them. Most juvenile arrests in the city happen at school. I mean, they talk about a dropout rate. When I went to California to the Tri-National Education Conference that happened there, I believe in 2008. They're like, well, this isn't a dropout rate, this is a push-out rate. They took us to this beautiful, brand new, state-of-the-art high school that was specifically built for minority children, had a state-of-the-art like sewing classes, and had state-of-the-art kitchens. So they could teach kids how to sew and they could teach kids how to cook. Because they knew these kids were not going to graduate high school, they were going to end up at the sweatshops down the street that are illegal, or they were going to end up in the back kitchen somewhere. And you could just see how they've put on this great facade. This is a charter school. We're going to fix education. But the only thing you're teaching kids how to do is go be servants. So that's my take on this education situation down here. I'm very, very skeptical of it. I don't trust it for my own kids. And in doing my research and going out and collecting stories, one of the things that came from my research is that education was a huge reason not to return. education was a major reason. It was a major push away from New Orleans. Once people got out and got into a better education system, they were blown away. On average, the average New Orleanian child who was displaced was 2 years behind. So they were in 11th grade making straight A's. Because of Katrina, they're in 9th grade now. 2 years older than everyone around them. They suddenly have homework for the first time. They suddenly have books that they can take home with them. There's not just a set of 20 books for 30 kids or 35 kids in one classroom. Everybody has a book. And everybody can take that book home with them. It's not like the next class needs to use it. It's not like they need to share it. It's not like the book is 15 years old. I mean, when I was gutting out schools, some of the materials that we came, like their history books, were literally 20 years old. Like, how, that does not only how much history have we made in the past 20 years, but Pluto is no longer a planet. Oh, wait, maybe it is again. But during that time period, you know, like the academic books don't contain that because they're so old and so dated.
So I want to ask you about the housing system.
Okay. It's another thing I've researched.
I know you have.
I've gutted so many houses.
So some of the things we've heard, the projects that were here are being renovated, revamped. They're going to be great. They're better than could ever have been anticipated. This is something the city is proud of. They talk about with pride. Who is living or going to be living in those areas that are now what used to be Magnolia and the like? What's happening in those areas from your perspective, from the research you've done?
From the research that I've done, there's a great study by Popkin and several other folks. I believe it's Susan Popkin. It came out in 2004, before the hurricane. And it was a study on Hope 6. Hope 6 is housing opportunities for people everywhere. That was the legislation, I believe it was originally passed in the early 90s. 1992 is the date I want to recall. I think it was Clinton administration. I could be wrong on some of those things. But it was the realization that severely distressed public housing units needed to be fixed, and that some of the models of public housing didn't work. But a lot of the assumptions that went into Hope 6 didn't really address some of the underlying causes of why public housing didn't work. Public housing didn't work because it was originally designed not for the poorest of the poor. It was designed for working people who could pay rent, who could pay enough rent to maintain the buildings. Over time, as the federal government went into these neoliberalism feelings and decided that they didn't want to support housing anymore, that they didn't want to pay for things, you saw disinvestment not just of cities, but you saw disinvestment of all federal programs for cities. And so in this process, you had these, the ways that cities, the way that they dealt with deciding to give less money was saying that this money now has to be targeted towards the people who need it the most. So the projects became not places for people who were just below the poverty line or were at the poverty line. It became for people who were severely depressed and so far below the poverty line that, you know, their rent might be $50 a month. You know, even if you have a bunch of people paying $50 a month, you still only have like $1,000 or $2,000. That might not cover all of the utilities. Just from people running their air conditioning down here, or people cooking on gas, you know, just you have all of these expenses that they have to pay for because the original projects were not set up for people to pay their utilities. They paid a rent and the facility took care of everything else. It was a one, you know, their fee. It wasn't like you pay your rent and you pay all of your utilities. So Hope 6 didn't address those issues. Hope 6 says this doesn't work because of the built structure. It doesn't work because we changed the grid and we cut places off. It doesn't work because we, you know, did all of these different things. They don't say it didn't work because we stopped funding it. It doesn't work because when these apartments fell so far into disrepair that they were no longer habitable, we just closed the door. We didn't check on them. We didn't keep people from squatting in them, because there's a waiting list a lot longer for public housing than public housing has ever existed in this country. You know, there's so many more people who need it than there are units available. So even if a unit is uninhabitable, if you're homeless, nobody's looking at it, I can go squat in here. That's where a lot of the problems in the projects came from, was it not necessarily people who had leases to be in the projects, but people who were squatting in the projects because the projects were not receiving enough federal, state, local, or generating enough income from their tenants to be able to do the maintenance. Anybody who lives in an apartment, anybody who lives in any type of housing sees, wear and tear. You have to replace things. Eventually wood needs to be replaced, eventually a floor or a window or carpet. All these different things, appliances, will need to be replaced over time. But if you can't pay your utilities, you're not going to be able to do these capital expenses, and there's no federal money coming to take care of these capital expenses. So now you have Hope 6 coming in saying the way to solve these problems is to knock it all down. We have these issues because we concentrated poor people. Not, that's what the issue is. So we're going to fix this by dispersing poor people. And so that's how they tout this as this great program. But there aren't a lot of, one of the things that this Popkin study reveals is that there's not a lot of evaluations. All of these programs and all of the individual projects under Hope 6, there's not some federal evaluation system to know if a project is good or bad, or what a project is supposed to do inside of this program. And so it's just created this system where it's really hard to know, well, who moves back into these? What happens? And so Hope 6 was built on this theory of mixed income communities. This is a theory that says if you have poor people in middle class or rich people, people who are fit with society versus the people who don't fit with society, the poor people, the people who don't fit with society will learn good skills. These will be great role models, and they will learn how to be productive members of society. Other research shows people don't mix. When you put poor people and middle class people in these mixed income communities, they don't mix. They don't get to know their neighbors. There have been studies that have shown, I can't give you any authors, but they show that heterogeneous communities don't mix. People stay inside of their houses. They don't come out on the street and meet folks. It's only when people are in homogeneous communities where everybody feels a part of the same community and feels that they have commonalities with each other that they start to mix and they start to get to know one each other. So that basic premise of mixed income communities being the wave of the future, being the way to alleviate poverty, is a flawed theory. Research has disproven that, but still our federal policies continue on this path. And so you have a situation in New Orleans where they were closing down projects before the storm happened. St. Thomas was converted into River Gardens, I think, or I might be calling it wrong. The St. Thomas projects, I think it's River Gardens now, up by Chapatulas where they put in the new Walmart. Where they put in the Walmart was a project! Now it's a Walmart! How many people do you think came back? But so in these communities, the way it's designed, just in the sheer design of the program, it's only allowed to allow 1/3 of the folks to come back. So say, I've done a lot of research on the St. Bernard, just different school projects for my thesis, for just random class assignments. And some of the folks in my thesis that I've done interviews with live next to St. Bernard or were residents in the St. Bernard. So I've kind of, and then being an activist, I was out there marching at different points in times. I've been in the St. Bernard projects, helped clean out the St. Bernard projects, and all sorts of Lafitte, Florida, like Gutton. When they said, though, we can't do nothing with these, we were cutting locks and going inside. And so you see St. Bernard was originally a space for it had 1,500 units, or just under 1,500 units at its peak. When the storm happened, at least half of those units were uninhabitable because of the disinvestment. There was no money to fix them up. So people want to say this is a high crime area. Well, the city owns this property. The city is not maintaining or taking care of this property. That could be one of the reasons why we have these issues, but we're going to blame it on the poor people instead because it's easier. We need a scapegoat. So of those, I think it was 790 families at the time of the storm that were in the St. Bernard projects, or of those units. When they're doing the redevelopment of the St. Bernard, let's see if I can recall the numbers. It was going to be, It's a third, a third, and a third. They were not replacing the 1,500 units because it's supposed to have a smaller footprint. So it's more like, I think the goal was around 500 maybe, 600 units, somewhere around there. It wasn't the full even 700 units that were occupied before. So then it's like 163 units are for people who, they call it place-based public assistance. Then you have another third that's like, another 160 that's the low income. So people who make 60% of area median income. And then you have a third that's market rate rent. But it also comes with all of these stipulations. So it's not just, okay, we're gonna let folks come back in. It's, well, to get back in, you have to have a job. If you have disability, that doesn't count as a job. You have to be working. You have to prove that you have some type of income. And if you're not working, you have to be a student.
So there's age discrimination as well, elderly people.
So they have their own project that's just for elderly. But the way that those projects work, or those, they don't call them projects, they call them buildings. But the way that the senior places work, they have one at the new Columbia Park, because we can't recognize the history of the place. We have to give it a new name so that people feel even further disenfranchised. This isn't your community anymore. We're changing the name because we want to erase your history. Because we're going to say it's crime and all of these bad things. But that negates the wonderful community where people, they knew neighbors and they had flowers, and not all aspects of the project were horrible places. If they were horrible places, people wouldn't have stayed in them for 20 and 30 years. They wouldn't have tried to raise their families. They would have found better solutions. Because there's one thing about poor folks, they always find solutions. Like you might not know where your food is coming from, but you're going to find a way. You're going to find a way to feed your kids. You're going to find a way to have housing. You're going to find something. You're going to make it work. Maybe not today, but it's going to be better tomorrow. And you keep trying. You don't stop, and you don't just give up. So inside of this housing situation that they have now, so they have those 163, those 700 or 800 families are now reduced to 163 that can return. They not only have they not only have to have some type of a job, they have to like the culture of New Orleans, hanging out on your front porch, you're not allowed to do that anymore. You have to get permission if you're going to have someone spend the night. They can only spend 1 or 2 nights. It's like
permission from who?
From the front office.
Run by who?
By the development corporation that got the contract to redo the projects. So for Columbia Park, it's Columbia Residential who runs, and they're the ones, their office managers who say this is what's going to happen here.
I'd kind of like you to say what you just said about the levees. When you do the levee tour, what do you show people?
Oh, when we do the levee tour, we show them the disparities. As you think, we're all taxpayers of the city. Everyone should have equal protection. But when you go out and you actually start walking the levees, you start to see, like, why is it that 80% of the city flooded? But the areas right along the river and right along the lake didn't get any water. That's because of the way New Orleans is created. You have the river, which is trying to flow to the lake. That's always been the course of the water. And so as they've drained stuff, they had to make these canals. And so New Orleans is kind of, the analogy we would use is the hot lunch tray, so that you have all of these ridges that make these different depressions, and you have all of these different bowls. And so water can get contained in one area without spilling into the next area. And so as you get out and you walk the levees, you start to see that before Hurricane Katrina, and most of the levee, because they only repaired the small portion that broke, although they talk about one breach in the lower 9th Ward, the different sources that I talked to, there were 4 breaches in that one area, 2 next to Claiborne and 2 closer down to Florida. And so you see, like, on the other side of the canal, like, so they fixed the lower 9th Ward side, but the upper 9th Ward side, you can still see the original wall. So that's what we'd show people. We'd start out in the lower 9th Ward, and you could see how when the water came in, like, the telephone poles were gone. Like, that's how much water came through, and the force and the effort, and the barge came through. It just knocked out everything. And there, you just see this crater that looked like it was a bomb blast. All of the houses moved up. And because they didn't do anything with the area for such a long time, when I came down 7 months after the storm for the first time, the barge had moved literally the week before. Like, I saw U-Hauls overturned in people's yards. And I had that thought, I know U-Haul got their insurance money. U-Haul's not worried about this truck. They're not going to come find this truck. They just wrote it off. Now it's going to be up to that resident that has to displace this truck. Not only did they lose their house and everything that they owned, but this might not even be their U-Haul. They might not have been the one who rented it. It might have been from, 3 blocks down. But now it's on their property and they're going to be the ones who have to deal with it. Nobody knew where the barge came from. Nobody knew why the barge was there. But the second they figured it out, it was gone overnight. But they let it sit there for 6-7 months. But the people who owned that barge knew it was theirs. They weren't like, where did our barge go? They knew they had parked it somewhere. Why didn't they follow up on it? So what we would do with the levee tour is we would start out with the lower 9th Ward, and we would explain to them the levee situation down there. We would show them now you have a wall that comes up 10 feet or 12 feet high, that's about a foot thick. It was originally supposed to go into the ground with metal rebar. It didn't. One of the reasons they say it failed. And so now it's supposed to be down there with metal rebar. We watched some of them pound it in. And then you go across, as you come across the industrial canal, you can see that the original wall was 6 inches wide, like 4 or 5 feet high, not even. It looked like a wall that would go around an apartment complex. It looked like a wall, not a levee system, not something to protect anything. And so after we would show them the levees there, then we would take them up to the volunteers that we were working with. We would take them up to the French Quarter and show them the levee system at the French Quarter. Because at this French Quarter, you don't realize it, but the levee starts at Decatur Street and goes all the way to the river. There are no hills in New Orleans unless they've been man-made. So when you realize that everything is at an incline, like they pushed up a whole bunch of dirt. You wonder why certain areas of New Orleans are low, because they scooped up the dirt to put it somewhere else. And so as they've made these huge earthen structures, they're not just a concrete wall. Because when you think about it, water is a very dynamic material. Like it always changes. It can freeze, it can, levels can go up and down. It's always changing. Concrete is very static. It doesn't change. It doesn't adjust to change as well. So earthen levees generally don't fail. Earthen levees are an issue about water overtopping. So when you get to the French Quarter, not only do you see this great big hill that's been erected, but you also see these great big huge floodgates. So, as you're going out onto the levee, that's just a park. No one thinks about it as a levee. You're like, I'm just going to the river. I'm going to see the bridge. I'm just going to see something beautiful. You start and you really look at, oh, wow, all of this was created. This is earth on top of steel and concrete and all of these other materials. And then they have this they've got the hill, they've got the earth, and then they've got this flood wall. So if the river should get so high, because it's not going to break through all of our defenses, but if it should get so high that it overtops the levee system, we've got this great big flood wall. And then we would bring them to UNO's campus, or to not to UNO's campus, but we would bring them out to the Lake Pontchartrain, so that they could see the levee system around Lake Pontchartrain. And you could see that the first defense is a series of steps that I believe go 20 or 30 feet down into the lake, and they act to break the waves, and they break the tide 30 feet out, so that by the time it's hitting the top of the steps or hitting, your feet, it's not as strong as what it was. And then you have a 4-lane highway and a park. Again, another earthen levee structure that was built, that was put there. And then you have a 10-foot hill that surrounds the campus. So you can see, the only way water is going to come, obviously when it rains, it floods. Like rain coming straight down collects. Water has to be pumped out of the city. But the only way water is going to come from the lake is if it overtops this barrier. So then it's like, well, if we have such great defenses all along the water, how could the intersections flood? And you see that the intersections flood because when you leave the lake and you start watching the water going into the canals, you see you have this huge earthen levee, you have this huge park, and all of a sudden, as it starts to drain back through the neighborhoods, it turns into a corrugated steel wall. And as you move further and further in, it just becomes a creek beside someone's house. There's a little bit of a slant. I grew up in Iowa. There was a creek behind my house. It was a good distance down. I don't know how to describe it, you know, maybe 10, 15 feet that we went from our backyard down to get to the creek. But our creek wasn't fed by the Mississippi River, wasn't fed by Lake Pontchartrain, the two trying to come together. We were in an area where we had massive, huge storms that would come through and would cause water levels to rise. There wasn't an issue of flooding from the little tiny creek behind our house, but this levee system, these canals were purposefully built so that the water that typically drenches this swampland can be contained. So why, when it gets into neighborhoods that don't have as much money as the $1 million houses near the French Quarter or the $1 million houses sitting along Lake Pontchartrain, why does it just become corrugated steel? Why does it just become a little slab of concrete? Why does it just become, you know, a creek? Why isn't there this realization that this is fed by these huge water systems and that this is the runoff area? You can't have this area weak.
So is that still the case? We are in 2015, right? Did I get that right?
Yes.
We're in 2015. Has there been anything done to really protect the areas of the city that are already rebuilding? I mean, I've gone back through and there's regrowth and rebuilding in those same spots. So
I'm not an engineer. I cannot say how well they've done things. I can just tell you that people are very, very skeptical about stuff. One of the reasons why, they cut a lot of corners. You know, and if they had cut corners properly, we wouldn't know that they had cut corners. It's very common that when people do work with concrete, one of my friends is an engineer who used to do levee tour with me, so he taught me some things. But he was saying that, you know, it's very common when doing concrete work that sometimes you put newspaper and you pack things in with newspaper. But when you do a levee system that's just failed and flooded an entire community, you wouldn't want people to cut corners, especially when they said the reason it failed the first time is because we cut corners. And not only did they cut corners, but they were able to go and pull the newspaper out of the levee wall. So, like, we know you cut corners because you did it so poorly it's already falling apart. This is our protection system, and we can pull, you know, a current newspaper out of the wall. Like, there's some story, I'm sure you can find it on Times-Picayune, where a journalist is reading his article from his, you know, newspaper that he just pulled out of the levee. So yes, they've done some things, but I'm not so confident in the things that they've done.
So we have to wrap up here in a minute. Two things. One, I'm going to ask you again your personal decision to stay here, given everything you just told me. Why are you living here?
There are many reasons I'm living here. First and foremost, it was never an intent to come to New Orleans and stay. I came to help. I came to do what was needed because I realized it was my fate too. Maybe I didn't come because I realized it was my fate. I realized it was my fate when I got here. I came because I could. I realized I was a college student, and we can look back at history and we can talk about the civil rights movement and we can talk about all of these great things that black folks had done. And I felt like this was my moment. This is the time where I'm a college student, where I'm not shackled to a job, I'm not shackled to a family. I can kind of come and go as I please. And there was no one depending on me for their survival. So I felt like I could go and help. So because I was at that time in my life where I felt I had the opportunity, I thought it was important to take advantage of it, but I was scared because the Spring Break Initiative was about political education. They didn't have us come to New Orleans. They had us meet in Selma, Alabama. The first thing that we did was walk across the bridge. You know, we went to the civil rights movement there. They taught us, they explained what we were getting ready to step into. It was very much about awakening us as the next generation of black folks in this country, of black college students who can create and affect change. After I left, I came down for a week for spring break. I was going to be homeless for the summer of 2006. And so instead of trying to pop a tent in Central Park or be homeless in New York City, I decided at least down here they had grass where I could pop a tent. So I reached back out to the organization The organization had gone through a split, and they wouldn't answer or return my phone calls. So I called up the organizers that I had worked with, the people driving me around that I'd seen doing all the work. And they said, oh yeah, we still working. We're with the People's Organizing Committee. Like, oh, we got space for you. We got volunteer housing. And I was like, great, I'm not gonna have to pop a tent. So I came down, and because I made a 3.5-month commitment, I was volunteer staff. In the course of that, my husband, now husband, I met. And at the end of the summer, I went back. I had to finish my degree. I wasn't going to let anything stop me from accomplishing my goals. And he ended up moving up there. But in the realization that I met my husband and I was brought to my path because of coming down to the city, I thought it was important to spend my first year of marriage in service. And so instead of choosing to where his father's from New Orleans, but at the time of the storm, he was living in Atlanta. So instead of going to Atlanta, where his house was and his life before the storm was, we both decided that we would come down here instead and spend our first year in service working for the organization that brought us together. And so we worked for the New Orleans Survivor Council. Spent so many years working for it, now I can't say it. No, the New Orleans Survivor Council. It was an organization started by residents, run by residents, and there wasn't a board of directors. When you want to talk about Iris Marion Young's power dynamics, which I found out about later, they had a model called the story circle, where at every meeting, everyone sat in a circle. Every meeting, everyone had a chance to speak, and not everyone had a chance to speak. There was a timekeeper. Everybody had the exact same amount of time to speak. And we went around in the circle. If you didn't want to speak, you had to say a pass. You know, like your space was given to you. It wasn't something you had to fight for, and your time ended. So it wasn't like you could get up there and speak for 5 minutes. Everybody had 2 minutes. Everybody had a minute. Everybody would agree, this is how long we're gonna take in this round. We can have as many rounds as we need. Then there would be a time for crosstalk, so you could have an open conversation. But still, comments needed to be kept short. And just this way you saw it, they talked about it as a way of harvesting the genius out of people, because you would get all of the ideas, you know, and there wasn't judgment. It was everybody putting out what you have to say, and it was about listening to what other folks had to say. And so I learned how to become a facilitator under this model, to really focus on where people agreed, because we did everything by consensus. So it wasn't a question of, you know, what does the majority think? It was, where are our agreements so that we can move forward on work? And we were always looking for where we agreed, and where we agreed, we moved forward. And we did a lot of things, so many amazing things that we can save for next time. But in the course of doing this work, it really was important to me to give back. And then, you know, we started off saying, you know, where I'm from an all-white community. I've always been searching for Black folks. I've always been searching to know the other half of my culture. And anytime I go around Black folks, they look at me and they can tell I was raised by white people. They can tell. They're like, oh, you know, you sound a little different. Where are you from? And down here, you know, I don't have the accent, so it's even worse. Not worse, but it's more noticeable that I am from somewhere else. But I've never received the welcome that I've received in New Orleans. And it's not just something that I received because I came as a volunteer to help. Yes, there was some of that in the beginning because I was here as a volunteer to help. But now my roles have changed. But still, as I meet people, they're just so warm. They're just so generous. They're just so open. It's just, I remember going back to New York after the summer and thinking that there was something wrong with me because I wanted to talk to everybody I saw. And not just say hi. I wanted to ask them how they were doing. I wanted to wait for a response because I had grown accustomed to this culture where you're rude and you're disrespectful if you don't do these things. So in the process of that, I went to New York and I decided if I wanted to talk to people, I was going to talk to people. I have never seen so many smiles. People didn't respond to me. People didn't say hi back. But the fact that I took the time to say hi to people who crossed my path and asked them how they were doing pulled them out of their world enough to be like, wow, somebody noticed me. And they would smile as they walked away. It was the coolest thing ever. That's why I'm here. And now I'm studying Katrina. One of the hardest things about coming down and volunteering was going back and talking to my friends and family. They wanted to know what I had been through. But I honestly, one of my roommates told me, you know, and she's a good person, it's not a personal judgment against her, and I wouldn't want anyone to take it that way. But she looked at me and said, I'm never gonna believe what you have to say. I'm not gonna believe that the government purposely tried to kill people. I'm not gonna believe any of it. I can't believe that. until I go see it with my own eyes, and I am never gonna go see it with my own eyes. It just told me, like, I cannot believe anything that you have said. The only thing that will make me believe it, I'm not going to do. Not I'm not willing to do, I am not going to do. I tell you that right now. I understand you come to me and you tell me that people are trying to kill you, that the government doesn't care about you, that you're gonna be next. I understand that I am also a person of color and that I am in the same boat, but I'm never gonna go see this. I'm not going to recognize this. And so when I realized, because I borrowed too much money and I had no way of paying it back because my degree didn't give me practical skills, that I had to go back to college, it was natural to go into sociology because I've always been about how society works and how people relate. One of the reasons I was leaving Iowa was to find this truth because I knew suburbia wasn't it. I knew there was so much more to life and that there were so many different experiences, even though in suburbia you're taught everything is all the same. No matter where you go, it's all gonna look like this. And now, due to gentrification, there are a lot of places that all look the same, but the culture is very, very, very different. And so, in coming down here and just having the chance to not experience the culture of the food and the music and the things that people think about when they think about New Orleans, but coming down and experiencing the people and the way that people treat each other. The media gives New Orleans a bad rap. You know, they only focus on the negative things. But it's the beauty of the people that have me here, that have me realizing when I needed to go back to school that what I wanted to do was make my voice credible. I wanted people to pay attention to the stories that I had heard. And going through all this academia and learning all of these scholarly reports doesn't change my reality, but somehow, sometimes in some conversations, not all, in some conversations, it makes me appear a little bit more credible because I can put PhD behind my name, almost. But still in those personal relationships with friends and family, you know, being from a white area, I have a lot of white friends that do not look at these Ferguson and these police-related murders as an issue, as a systemic issue. And so, you know, I've come head to head on certain things. They still, you know, they know I'm a scholar of race, class, and gender. They know that's what I study. And still, when I start talking about these things and saying these things are white privilege or saying these things are institutionalized racism and calling out certain behaviors and certain things I see, I'm just a black person. I don't have a voice. I don't have an opinion. It doesn't matter how educated I am. It doesn't matter that I have more degrees and more education than they do. They're white. They're never going to hear me. But I'm not going to stop talking. So that's why I'm here. I'm at UNO because I knew it was important to get these stories out, and that's why I'm participating in this project. Who knows how it's going to be used? Who knows what the end of anything is going to be? I do believe you guys have the best of intentions. I do know the saying says the best of intentions can lead to hell sometimes. Not anything against you, not for you to leave that in the interview or anything like that, but just the realization that things are never going to change unless we start talking about it, and things are never going to change if we don't call our society out on its poor behavior. A lot of these things are hidden. You don't think about them. You don't say, well, why did I cross the street? Why did I hold my purse a little bit closer? Why am I all of a sudden scared? You know, people don't sit down and say, oh, it's because it's a black man. I don't act that way when it's a white man crossing the street. But how are we going to fix it if we don't do something, you know? This is how we do something about it.
It's definitely a start.
Gotta try.
Gotta try. Thank you so much.
Of course.